We're gonna keep it funky. Oh yes. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? It's who we are. We all emerge in the funk, the love push that got us out. And we're not here that long. One day our bodies will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. That's funky too. What a blessing to be here. Oh, yeah. How blessed I am to be here, though, brother. Just to be sitting next to you.
Likewise.
Younger generation. I'm old school, you new school, but same struggle.
He's so polite, it kills me. It just kills me. It doesn't stop.
Different.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are on Aboriginal land, and on behalf of the organizers, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal owners of the land that we're on, and pay our deep respects to their elders, past and present. Dr. West, welcome to Melbourne.
I tell you, I want to salute all of you all. Oh, look at all these beautiful folk here. I want to salute each and every one.
This is Melbourne, so they're clapping for you, but they're also clapping for Melbourne.
Oh, yes. No, indeed. Well, you know, you got Sister Susie and Brother Desh. They've got Melbourne connections, and Think Inc. is a visionary organization.
Absolutely.
Thank them for bringing me all the way down to this land and meet these magnificent human beings. And I've had a great time since I've been here. We've been on the move. We were in Perth just yesterday morning, and
Sydney tomorrow.
Sydney tomorrow. You know, we started in Redfern with Sister Lola, with the precious Aboriginal Indigenous brothers and sisters, and that magnificent struggle. But I've been blessed really to be so inspired by both the I call them love warriors, and especially the activists and the artists. You know, Sister Maxine was magnificent, Brother Al Fresh. Give it up for the artists, you know. Give it up for the artists, you know, artists. You know, the great Shelley say artists are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They really are the vanguard of the species. They have the courage to examine the dark precincts of their own soul and lay bare the truths, and the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. And most of us like to be right in the middle, lukewarm, well-adjusted to injustice, making our little move from mama's womb to tomb. You say, no, the artists, they're going to sit back and say, look, this is the challenge instead of challenges. And in fact, for me, when you think about white supremacy, male supremacy, or it can be anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Arab hatred, it can be wealth inequality, it can be ugly imperial subjugation. Those are not problems, those are catastrophes. See, there's no such thing for me as an Aboriginal problem. There's a catastrophe visited on Aboriginal peoples, and they have responded to that catastrophe beginning with 17, what is about 17, when did Brother Cook arrive?
What is the exact date of Cook's landing? 1770?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we've had the same problem in the Western Hemisphere, in the States and Latin America and other places. But what the fact that our dear brother, I mean, for me, he's a living legend, Brother Gary Foley. The fact
One more time
he's
for Dr.
right
Foley.
Here with us, long distance runner for freedom, and you can see he's still on fire. It's a beautiful thing to be on fire for justice. It's a beautiful thing. Justice is what love looks like in public, which means he's on the love train. He's on the love train.
A cranky love train.
Yeah. You see, I come from a tradition, you know, Curtis Mayfield said, people get ready. There's a train coming. Don't need no ticket, just get on board. But what you need is courage, willingness to cut against the grain, take a risk, deal with the consequences, sacrifice your popularity for integrity, be linked to something bigger than your egocentric predicament, and then have a smile on your face. Oh, yeah. Then have a smile on your face. Because you have to preserve your style. You have to preserve your style. You see, what the status quo, whatever color people running the status quo, what they want to do is somehow try to destroy your spirit and your soul and your style. And once they do that, you will forever be walking around humped over. Well, once your style and spirit is in place, you straighten your back up. And Brother Martin used to say, anytime, every day people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because folk can't ride your back unless it's bent. Once you straighten it up, take a stand, then you're in a different space. But there's a special brother too I want to acknowledge. His name is Brother Trail Dowie. Now, 9 years ago, he showed up in Princeton, and I didn't know him from Adam, you know. And he said he just wanted to talk philosophy. He'd been reading about my work all this time, and he had sold everything he owned to come for a 30-minute office hour. I said, wow, I believe in sacrifice, but that's taking it a bit far. But and we spend hours together. He's come now every year, and it's very fascinating because today he just received his letters of having his dissertation, fascinating dissertation on philosophy and all that jazz. Nietzsche, Merleau-Ponty, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison. And he just received it today, the very day I get a chance to see him in Melbourne. Where is he over there? Just raise your hand. Raise your hand, Brother Trail. Oh, love you, brother. Love you, brother. Respect you, brother. Definitely. Sister Tammy is companion with my daughter, Zaytun. But I say all that to say, I'm glad to be here. I really am. And I come to learn and listen, but also to be in deep solidarity with, and it's the Aboriginal brothers and sisters I start with, but of course I am also in solidarity with the working class people here, because you got wealth inequality, you got free market policies that's generating unbelievable social suffering, and there has to be ways of making that connection. You see, when Brother Gary made that claim that our vanilla brothers and sisters here in this white supremacist democracy, and I say white supremacist because even though 72 does create a rupture, there's no way you're going to have institutionalized hatred, contempt, and disrespect of precious peoples for long periods of time, and then have one act here, two acts there, and think that somehow you've overcome your racist legacy. History doesn't work that way. And I try to remind my vanilla brothers and sisters, you know, they walk up to me, well, Brother West, I'm not a racist, but my grandparents have much work to do. And I say, well, let me tell you something, that I'm a free black man. I'm a Christian, so I'm a Jesus-loving free black man for 62 years. And I have white supremacy inside of me. I got male supremacy too. I got imperial arrogance too. I got to kill it every day. And if I got white supremacy inside of me, but vanilla brothers and sisters, my hunch is you got some work to do too. Because history is not about purity. It's not about being pristine. History deposits these things inside of us, and we have to kill it, kill it, kill it.
So we started talking in Perth the other night, and I feel like we can talk for months.
We had a good time in Perth, though, didn't we?
We did.
We did. It is.
I just want to go back to something we just started to touch on when we finished, which was, as Gary mentioned, the incarceration and murder of black people in America. And speaking of disrupting events to disrupt white supremacy, we're getting near the end of the Obama administration, which began with the slogans of hope and change. Right. And now, as the credits roll, the song is Black Lives Matter.
That's true.
People simply demanding not to be murdered and incarcerated by the state. So I'm wondering if, because Obama's presidency has always been marked by, well, we'll just wait a little bit longer. We'll just wait a bit longer. Let him get in office. First term, second term.
Right.
Now, can we make a clear assessment of what has or hasn't been achieved and what the ultimate legacy you think of the Obama administration is?
Well, it's a wonderful question because there's a number of different levels and dimensions to talk about it. One is we do have to acknowledge that when you have an American social experiment on indigenous people's land with vicious legacies of white supremacist slavery and white supremacist Jim and Jane Crow, which are forms of U.S. terrorism against black people. The election of a black man is a moment of symbolic progress, because it was hard to conceive of, the White House was primarily built by black slaves. I mean, that's important to keep in mind. To have a black man, black family in the White House is just inconceivable given the depths of vicious legacies of white supremacy. And of course, that's what made it very difficult for a lot of black folk to be critical of the president. And it's, in a certain sense, it's understandable, but it's not justifiable. But you do have to acknowledge that piercing of the glass ceiling. But what also happens when you're head of an empire, when you're head of a capitalist economy, when you're head of a racist criminal justice system, you have to make certain decisions. And when Brother Barack Obama began to make decisions, he's going with Wall Street rather than Main Street. Here comes Tim Geithner and Larry Summers straight out of Wall Street. He's going with massive surveillance rather than fighting for rights and liberties. And then they basically lied about it until a brother named Edward Snowden pulled the cover on them. He still sits, of course, in Russia, stateless, as it were. And similarly so in terms of the drone situation. You know, you decide, are you going to bring Brennan in, who is the head of counterinsurgency that shifts from capture and incarcerate to assassinate? And when Barack Obama made all three of those decisions, it was very clear that he was not going to be part of the same tradition that produces fundamental commitment to self-determination, self-respect of poor people, working peoples, Aboriginal peoples, black peoples, whatever. He himself was going to be not only well-adjusted to injustice, but he was going to provide ways of hiding and concealing the forms of injustice. And that's why he would say over and over again, even up to this very moment, that racism is not endemic in the criminal justice system. You say, brother, look, you know, we were born at night, but not last night. Come on. Get off the symbolic crack pipe now. Quit lying. Now, of course, now, Brother Gary was hard on the politicians, though, wasn't he? He said, all of them are. I'm a Christian. I don't cuss the way he does, but I appreciate his opinion. Because it is true that you've got so many thick forms of mendacity in the political systems. And the United States is tied to big money. And it also hides and conceals forms of criminality. That's why Wall Street executives who engaged in massive criminality, insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent activity, predatory lending, not one Wall Street executive went to jail. Even under Reagan, with the S&L crisis, 1,100 businessmen and women went to jail. Now, Reagan is not known for being on the cutting edge for social justice. But he did have a rule of law enough that it applied to the well-to-do. We have moved now so far to the right that under a neoliberal president, Barack Obama, like Bill Clinton, the neoliberalism of financialized, privatized, militarized. That's the basic response to social problems. Public education, privatize. Prison, privatize. Bring in big money. And a shift, of course, from that 1% of the population to now own 42% of the wealth in the United States, but 40% of the children of color and 22% of all the children, each one precious, live in poverty. The richest nation, the history of the world. That's a moral abomination. That's spiritually obscene. And no fragile democratic experiment can sustain itself in the face of that escalating oligarchic, plutocratic, and to some degree still pigmentocratic. And not fully, but to some degree.
And to what extent do you think that not just the demands of Black Lives Matter,
yes,
this just spontaneous, decentralized, militant, sort of complete grassroots mass movement, not just the demands of it, but the actual tactics of it, are a reaction to Obama's election, in the sense that you had this massive grassroots sort of collaboration, everyone pooling resources to get one person into the most powerful seat in office, versus now no centralized decision-making, no unified organization, which is not to say no unity, but people just completely going around the system. You won't let us use your media, we'll use our own media. You won't let us in the meeting, okay, we'll just stay in the streets, thousands of us.
No, that's real. I think that part of what happened, brother, is that thick forms of sleepwalking set in the black community when Obama won. Because, racism cuts so deep that a lot of times the bar is so low in regard to black expectation of white embrace of black humanity. And so folks would say, Brother West, we already got enough enemies. You don't need to be engaged in your progressive critique. Let's just preserve the brother, make sure he doesn't get shot, doesn't get killed, make sure his kids are not violated, even if he has policies that we might have disagreement with. You see, that's low expectation. You see, that's like going to a concert looking for John Coltrane and Kenny G shows up. It's like, hey, Kenny G blows horn all right, but he know that it's real. The Coltrane loves Supreme. And when I show up to a concert, I'm looking for Coltrane. You know what I mean? I'm not paying money to hear Kenny G. I watch him on television. But my money too precious to be. Now I know a whole lot of folk. Kenny Garrett and others I want to listen to. Or Robbie Coltrane himself, the son of John, who's beautiful. I just with him a couple of weeks ago. But I say that to say that every 28 hours for the last 10 years, a black person, brown person was shot by the police and security guard. Every 28 hours. So it's been going on for a long time. Michael Brown was just a peak of a huge iceberg. But what happened was there was a level of disrespect that pushed young folk to the edge. The body, you all know the story, the body sat there for 4.5 hours. The mother tried to gain access to it. The blood was flowing, dogs urinating on the body. Now, how long you gonna take that? How long you gonna take it? Just like the slave insurrection of the United States. When they buried a slave baby, that was often the cause of slave insurrection. And every slave insurrection, every slave was executed. You just ready to die. This is too much. I'm sick and tired of all this mess. I'm willing to pay the ultimate cost. I break the back of fear. It only happens every 30, 40 years in the States. Because we got a strong ruling class, entrenched. And they believe in repression. They will shoot a Negro down, shoot a black woman down, shoot a black man down, across the board. Medgar, Malcolm, we can go Bobby Hutton, Fred Hampton, and on and on and on, you see. So you reach the point, you say, oh, Lord, I can't take this. I know about the statistics, but to see the precious body and the mama crying and the kids hollering, that's also at work. Now, that's spiritual. That's not just political. That's not black people fighting for rights. That's saying you have crossed the Rubicon. You've gone too far. That our humanity is so debased that we have to deal with this. And then, lo and behold, all the other videos start showing up. But the videos were just laying bare what was in place all this time. Now, keep in mind that you got black president, black attorney general, black cabinet security of Homeland Security, all three of them. Black faces in the highest places. And during the 7 years in place, 6.5 years in place, not hardly a mumbling word. And not one policeman has gone to jail for shooting any of those folk. Not one. You say, good God Almighty. That's why when Brother Gary talks about, well, folks in denial. And it is a denial, but when we flesh out, what is the denial? There's a massive indifference toward the suffering. There's a huge callousness toward the suffering. We know if this were happening on the vanilla side of town, there would be town halls on U.S. television every week. CNN would kick in. MSNBC, take Fox a little longer. You see? Meaning then they say, oh my God. Now see, the real danger, as you can imagine, is that in keeping track of the vicious legacy of white supremacy, we also have to keep in mind the way in which class operates. Because you see, if the black youth who were shot were upper middle class, if they were the children of Oprah Winfrey, and I love Sister Oprah, but she's a bourgeois sister. And by bourgeois, what I mean is not just highly moneyed, but rarely speaking out on issues that affect poor people. That's why she never had one blues artist on her show in over 20 years. B.B. King cried, can't get on Oprah's show. I'm the king of the blues. He gone now, but he'll always be the king, you know. And she's from Mississippi, you know. But I mean, I say that because if the upper middle class black kids were being shot at the same level as the poor black kids, you have different kind of black leadership. So the class issue cuts in. And then, of course, that's where the embrace of white working class, black working class, red working class, yellow working class, dealing with the capitalist economies and systems that we have to contend with.
And we were speaking again the other night about how race and class operate, particularly in respect to, you know, the threats of closure for remote communities, because we were saying that not only is there just the blatantly racist rhetoric of basically needing to do away with Aboriginal culture, and Aboriginal culture doesn't need to be preserved, and connection to land and country is irrelevant, but also the idea that, you know, as we said, that the governments use language like this is a lifestyle choice. Yeah. And for all, and you know, honestly, for all the outrage that caused, the opposition has used identical language previously. You know, Jenny Macklin, who was Kevin Rudd's Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, said that remote communities were not viable. You know, this completely neoliberalized language of genocide, where now you can talk about Aboriginal culture as if it's like a failed business model. So, and speaking of young black agency, as we were before, we should acknowledge the warriors of the Aboriginal resistance, as Gary did, and the SOS Black Australia campaign.
SOS, yeah, we just saw them in Brisbane. Yes, no, absolutely.
Phenomenal. But,
I mean, I was blessed to go to the tent embassy there in Brisbane yesterday and had a magnificent time, but the SOS brothers and sisters were there as well.
So my question was, because, and I think you were asked this the other night, you know, about the legacy of incarceration and murder of black people in America and Aboriginal people here, and you said that, you know, the roots of a system inform how it will always operate. So when a country or a nation is built on genocide or slavery or theft, it will always defend that wealth by the same means. It will adapt in some way. So you get rid of slavery, but then you get a massive prison industrial complex. Aboriginal people get recognized as human beings and get the right to vote, but ultimately it doesn't matter because through years of imposed neglect, the life expectancy is lowered. When we live in these settler colonial societies, US, Canada, Australia, Israel, when the core of the culture, where the fundamental DNA of the system is racist, and when crimes have been committed that cannot be compensated, how do we begin to imagine some kind of a just future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a profound question because it's also a philosophical question. Most of human history has been a history of cycles of forms of domination and oppression and exploitation, and cycles of hatred and revenge, envy and resentment. And so, you know, Hegel looked at history and saw a slaughterhouse. You know, Gibbon looked at history and saw crimes and follies. Karl Marx looked at histories and saw unbelievable economic exploitation of precious human beings who live lives of wasted potential and unrealized possibility. Looking at human history is not a pleasant affair. at any time. And looking at our present moment, which is a catastrophic moment, ecological catastrophe impending, nuclear catastrophe still a real possibility with the escalation of the Cold War between the Russian Empire and the American Empire. The economic catastrophes of inequality, of course, vicious forms of patriarchy and male supremacy against the vast majority of human beings on the globe, the sisters of all colors, domestic violence, homophobia still running amok in so many ways, losing sight of the precious humanity of gays and lesbians and bisexuals and transgender precious peoples. We have to be very honest and say anybody who has the audacity to still talk about loving poor and working people are cutting so radically against the grain. That's what I love again about Brother Gary, see, that he's a long distance runner. He recognizes as progress in 72, look back 40 years, regress. What you gonna do, Brother Gary? I'm still choosing to be a freedom fighter. In which form? Telling the truth. The great Du Bois, he was one of the great freedom fighters of the 20th century, even though he comes out of the American Empire. 89 years old, he's under house arrest in Brooklyn, which is the greatest borough in the United States. And he's visited by one other black freedom fighter who's also under house arrest in Philadelphia named Paul Robeson. And he said, I want to write a love letter to the younger generation because I'm running out of gas and it looks like so much of what I've done is in vain. This is W.B. Du Bois talking this way. And he embarks on the writing of a trilogy of novels. The first novel, The Ordeal of Manzar. I think it's about page 275. He says, these 4 questions I'm wrestling with. And this is the questions to your question. You know, how shall integrity face oppression? Who still wants to live a life of integrity in a moment of vast cupidity, mendacity, and criminality? That's where we are now. The second question, what does honesty do in the face of deception? All the lies. How do we hold on to just being an honest human being? I don't care what color, what culture, what civilization, what sexual orientation. Do we have the courage to really pursue integrity, intellectual, spiritual integrity, and then just honesty? And the boy says his third question is, what does decency do in the face of insult? And then the last one is, how does virtue meet brute force? When you live in a decadent civilization, the cultivated capacities for integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue become weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And you end up with a highly gangsterized culture and gangsterized society. Given all the rhetoric of the politicians and the pundits and so forth, everybody sits back and knows they lying. That's just not true. They're not coming to terms with being honest. Where's the integrity? Now, in the United States, those persons who opt for integrity, honesty, and decency are profoundly countercultural. The market culture has taken over. And the market culture is obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. I mean, the business page is just nothing but just scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal tied to politicians who are on the news with big monies. They need the money in order to fund their elections and so forth. So what happens, again, the artists have to play a role. And as we know, we've talked about this, and you got some deep insight on this, brother, that one of the reasons why the music for the younger generation is so thin and empty and tied to body stimulation and titillation, no story, no drama, hardly any instruments played, just computers, very few groups that sing together, raising their voices because they just want autonomous voices and a microphone to make money for the oligarchs, the same oligarchs that control recording and video and live performance. You see. And radio too, with the payola going on. And you say, my God, was Samuel Beckett right? And Samuel Beckett called it a mess. That's what he said human history is. It's a mess. The quantity of tears are constant. Yeah. You say, well, Samuel Beckett, you've got the right challenge, but let's go with Chekhov. Then Chekhov said, well, it's going to come and go. There will be waves of awakening that are moral, political, and spiritual when integrity, honesty, and decency becomes something people are willing to live and die for. There'll be other moments in which they're pushed to the margins, and it's all about just getting over by any means. It's the triumph of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Might makes right. Force really defines what ought to be the case. You know, it's Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. We know the truth, but keep deception working in order to reproduce structures of domination and call yourself purveyors of liberty. Our artists, at their best, they see it. Now, what happens when the artists themselves become so commodified and so marketized? Because we all need money. All of us need money, there's no doubt about it. But when the market mentality becomes a soul one, then at that point, you know, the cockroaches are waiting. Because the planet goes. The whole planet goes with the corporate greed that's driving so much of the squeezing of every ounce out of the planet for profit, you see.
And we were talking about how at this explosive moment in American history, how hip-hop, which is the descendant of blues and jazz, the music of Black Pain, how mainstream hip-hop is so deafeningly silent on the issue.
It's true.
And for all the reasons you just outlined, that hip-hop is no longer fringe music, it's dominant music. So it has and it will reflect largely the dominant culture, dominant values.
But because it is the lingua franca, it's the universal language of young people all around the world, and the part is just a result of American cultural imperialism. Because, I mean, blues and jazz are American imperial exports. They just happen to be critiques of white supremacy inside the belly of the beast, inside the U.S. itself. But it's still one that is more well-known. My dear brothers yesterday, Brother Wayne, Coco Wharton, I think, and Brother Bo were making the point about how Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are more known in Australia than some of the great heroes in the Aboriginal resistance movements. And that has to do with the impact of American culture on Australia, but not just Australia, on every corner of the globe. Right. And you know, and that's understandable. That's understandable because empires do tend to be center stage, cast their shadows in that way. We can learn from empires. All empires are not don't suffocate the voices of integrity, honesty, and decency. And we try to stay in contact with them. But it's clear that the hip hop in Colombia, hip hop on the West Bank, hip hop in Venezuela, much more political than hip hop in the United States.
Well, this is the other side of the coin. The global empire creates globalized resistance.
That's right.
And Gary was talking about internationalism and the links between, you know, the Black Power movement in the U.S. and the Black Power movement in Redfern. And we were speaking the other night about legacies. You know, 50 years since Selma, 50 years since Malcolm X's assassination, and they were both fiercely international. You know, in different ways.
Oh, no, absolutely.
But I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit, like you did the other night, about specifically Martin Luther King's radicalism, because there's a skepticism, I think, amongst radicals sometimes about King's legacy, which is a result of, you know, the sanitization of his memory, and what you call the Santa Clausification of heroes. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk to us about that, especially now, in terms of his position on war and occupation and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important never to deify any human being. All of us are cracked vessels, and we have much to learn Martin Luther King Jr. was a human being. He was a cracked vessel, but he was extraordinarily ordinary because of his profound commitment to integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue, and the fact that he was such a love warrior. And in his case, of course, like my case, it was deeply rooted in a connection and relation to a Palestinian Jew named Jesus, who was crucified by a Roman Empire because he ran money changers out of the temple. The temple in those days was a combination of Wall Street, Hollywood, White House, State Department, Pentagon. And I guess I've got to bring it home to Australia in terms of the political status quo here. Now, what does that mean? That means that Martin was not always going to be politically right, but he was always going to ensure that he never sold his soul for a mess of pottage. That's crucial these days. You see, that's why the Black Panther Party could have a picture of Martin, even though they disagree with him ideologically. But the picture signified this brother was for real. He was the real thing, the real deal. His love was concrete. They remember when Martin was in that paddy wagon for 4.5 hours, the same time that Michael Brown's body was on the way from Atlanta to Reedsville prison, all by himself with a German shepherd, and the German shepherd biting him or trying to bite him, barking at him, and Martin gets out. Andy Young and his father are only two there. Martin can't walk, looked like he had a nervous breakdown, and all he can say is, "This is the cross we must bear for the freedom of our people." You see, that's John Coltrane's Love Supreme concretized. When you have that kind of love, you say, this Negro is for real. I don't care if I politically disagree with him or not. He's on my side. And in Martin's case, you could see the ways in which he's struggling for rights within liberal order, and then his critique of liberalism, which becomes more and more devastating as he calls for the organizing of poor people of all colors, and of course the critique of American imperialism, of the American empire's foreign policy in Vietnam. The black leaders turn against him. When he dies, 72% of all Americans disapprove of Martin King. 55% of black people disapprove of Martin King when he did. Very important. Sacrifice popularity for integrity. But what would he say? Whitney Young, head of the Urban League. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You have set the black freedom movement back 2 generations. Martin said, Brother Whitney, what you say may get you a corporate sponsorship, but it won't get you a foothold in the kingdom of truth. You see, I'm tied toward unarmed truth and unconditional love. That's what Martin would say. They call him up. How? You sound like Radio Hanoi. That's what the New York Times said after he gave his famous speech criticizing Vietnam. You're a communist in the closet. Martin would say, I'm just trying to be a good man, and I guess a good man never has enough enemies. I got to be true to my calling. And so that radical king, with that radical love, radical analysis, calling for an embrace of all persons who are willing to take the risk of seriously aspiring to integrity, honesty, and decency.
I think it's so important that you say that, but we imagine these people to be leaders of popular movements, but they were, even in their own time,
cutting against
in the minority. And you talk about sacrifice, and I think what so many of us love about Malcolm also was his willingness to sacrifice. And one of my favorite pieces of footage of Malcolm is it's not at a speech. He's entering some building, and some reporter says, in relation to death threats, do you fear for your life? And Malcolm says very plainly, I don't fear death. I fear nothing whatsoever, because I live as a man who died 20 years ago. And he says it so polite. The sincerity is so clear, and he's not playing to a crowd. He's not being brash, and I feel like it's profound. He's saying something more than "I'm not afraid to be shot." I'm just wondering what your insights are on what he meant and what he was saying.
I think that when one looks at the varieties of wisdom in different religious and secular intellectual traditions, It could be great pagans like Socrates, and Plato, who talk about philosophia, love of wisdom, is meditation on and preparation for death. And by death, they don't mean just physical death. They mean learning how to die, being critical of yourself. And anytime you give up an assumption or presupposition, that's a form of death. And there's no way of learning how to live without learning how to die. The Greeks call it paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, which is deep education, not cheap schooling. Most of what goes on these days under education is just market-driven schooling. But the deep education is just learning how to die. Judaism and all of its richness and prophetic formulations wrestle with this sense of how, in fact, to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. A certain kind of fear and egoism has to die in order for the fulfillment or the connection with the covenant to be stronger. The New Testament, Paul himself, Jewish brother, of course, who made a major contribution in almost inventing Christianity based on the life of Jesus, talked about Christians must learn how to die daily. Was it Montaigne talked about to philosophize, to learn how to die. And Seneca, we don't expect too much profundity out of the Romans since they were so busy conquering the world. But when Seneca, he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. I think what Malcolm in part was saying was, anybody who wants to live intensely, critically, compassionately, must learn how to die. To kill something inside of yourself. In the same way, Australia will never be able to fully be itself until it kills white supremacy, until it kills male supremacy, until it kills wealth inequality and so forth. But Malcolm was able to enact it and embody it in such a short period of time. Because remember, he's a gangster up until 1949 and 50. And Elijah loves him into his X, that Malcolm Little to Malcolm X.
Detroit Red?
The Detroit Red, absolutely. And he had already dealt with death within those contexts. But he learned how to die in this high level or manner. And and the only way you do that is through love. I mean, that's the crucial thing. You got to love wisdom. You got to love your neighbor. You got to love justice. You got Christians like myself, love enemy, but you don't try that one on your own. You need a whole lot of grace for that. But love is the only thing that will break him.
And we love them because of their ability to move people well beyond their death, And I feel like, whether it's social movements or, progressive people, whatever you want to call it, we're constantly in this battle to try and move people, hearts and minds. And I want to give you an Australian scenario, because we talk about incarceration, but sometimes we don't talk about that other constantly expanding incarceration, which is detention of, so-called illegals everywhere, Europe, US, Australia.
Right.
So in 2001, a famous poll was done about how many Australians supported the policy of mandatory detention. And it was just before an election, and the numbers were something between 70 and 80%. And so everyone naturally thought, well, that's crazy because the majority of people can't possibly truly agree with this. It must be because the public doesn't really know what's happening to these people. It must be because they don't know what's happening in these detention camps. And so for the next 15 years, the campaigns were around education.
Information and education.
This is what's happening inside. This is what people are subjected to. These are the horrible places they come from. And the Australian public since then has been bombarded with every possible statistic, children dying at sea, boats sinking, all that kind of stuff. But the polls are done again and again, and the numbers simply do not change. So what happens when, as a movement, you face the sad reality that people are not only misled or misguided or uninformed, but that they actually know the bitter truth and they're okay with it?
And they're still okay with it.
How to move forward, or how to even think about moving forward or think it's worth moving forward?
Yeah, that's a tough one, though, brother. That's a tough one. I mean, I think the lead of the great inimitable James Baldwin is useful here, because Baldwin was one of the great love warriors, son of Harlem. Never went to college, but at least 2 colleges went through him in terms of self-education. And he would always make the point, he would say, if you don't come to terms with the catastrophe in my neighborhood, sooner or later, it will be on its way to yours. And when it's on its way to yours, then all of a sudden, there's a state of emergency. But the state of emergency has already been operating for a long time on the chocolate sides of town, on the chocolate sides of your country. So if you claim to be fundamentally committed to liberty and democracy and the language and nomenclature that you often like to use, if you don't come to terms with these catastrophes, it will ring down the curtain on the very things that are precious to you, because it's clear that black lives or Aboriginal lives are not that precious. So it's going to be your own children. And that can have some impact, you see. Martin King, of course, also had that same view. And it's also true. It's also true that Martin understood that the black freedom movement in the United States has been the leaven in the democratic loaf. See, if the black freedom movement in the United States did not promote love and justice, if it opted to opt for hatred and revenge, there had been a civil war in the United States every generation. Every generation. Which means the United States would be thoroughly autocratic, authoritarian, and fascist to the core. But it was Frederick Douglass saying, you all enslave us, we don't want to enslave you, we want freedom for everybody. And he connects with the workers' movement, the women's movement, and so forth. Look at the great moment in American history for me in the last 50 years in terms of spiritual maturity is when Emmett Till, you all know Emmett Till was the young brother who was killed in Mississippi in August of 1955. It was his killing was a real catalyst in some ways of the black freedom movement that people call the civil rights movement. His body was dropped in the Tallahatchie River. His head was three times the size of his ordinary head. And they had a funeral on the west side of Chicago, Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ. It was her only baby. His father had fought in the war, in the U.S. Army, the Jim Crow Army, but fought in the war. And she steps to the lectern and looks at all of the people there and all the cameras around the world. She had insisted on keeping the casket open. It was a big controversy. Mayor, the governor, others, please close the casket. She said, no, we're going to keep it open. She stepped to the lectern, tears flowing. And she says, I don't have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. Now, there's a level of spiritual maturity there that has to do with where she comes from. She'd rather be defeated for the moment and keep her integrity, honesty, and decency than win and be a gangster like those who had killed her child. Now, if the black freedom movement didn't have the Mamie Tills and the Martin Kings, and if those moments, like if Martin gave the eulogy for the 4 little girls who were killed in 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, if he had stood up and said, I believe in collective punishment. I believe we are going to engage in wholesale violent attack on white folk who have been accepting and deferential to white supremacist practices. That's civil war. That's one of the reasons why America is, in some sense, civilized. I mean, I tell white brothers and sisters, when you see Negroes, you ought to just give them a standing ovation. Just give them a standing ovation. We thank you for Martin King. We thank you for Frederick Douglass. We thank you for Curtis Mayfield. We thank you for Ray Charles. We thank you for Nina Simone. We thank you for John Coltrane, because we could have produced folk who were so upset with being hated for so long that it's just a matter of generating a hatred right back. People terrorized for so long, you're going to get the same treatment we are. That's what black people could have done. We decided not to do it. South Africa was the same way. Look at white folk just shaking when Nelson Mandela came out of jail. Oh my God, he gonna do to us what we've done to him. Time to go to New Zealand or somewhere. We got to get out of here.
Time to come to Australia.
Come to Australia too, a place where white folk can feel safe. What did Nelson do? You don't know me. I come from a people who's rooted in integrity and honesty. I never hated you all. I hated the injustice that you promoted. That's what Nelson said. That's what Martin King said. Y'all don't know. You don't know the tradition. Get to know the history and so forth. And that's true for my Aboriginal brothers and sisters here. You can listen to Gary Foley and keep track of the love that's flowing out of his soul. He's been at it now for almost 45 years, and he's still embracing the Anglo-Australian brothers and sisters, even though he's hating the complacency, the conformity, the deferential dispositions to a white supremacist status quo, even though it has made some progress in certain ways and regress in other ways, you see. And that's a precious tradition, and that's a tradition that many of us are willing to live and die for. What better joy in the world than loving oneself through the darkness and being willing not just to serve the people, but also to give your life back as a gift, because your life was not even yours in the first place. It was given to you by a power higher than you. It's a privilege to die for the people. It's a privilege to serve the people. It's a privilege to sing for the people. It's a privilege to be a comic artist of grand stature like yourself. Tell the truth.
My parents are in the audience somewhere.
Oh, yeah, and I salute your parents. I salute your parents. Like Aristophanes. Free speech, plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech, that parrhesia that the Greeks talked about. That's what the great comic artists, the Richard Pryors and David Chappelle's and the Moms Mableys and Dick Gregory's and others, that's the freedom that people see in that art, given these structures of unfreedom in their lives. And people see it in the music. You see it in Schubert, you can see it in Beethoven, you see it in Chopin, you see it in Brahms. The unbelievable courage to think for oneself, to be free, knowing that once the concert is over, you're walking right back into society and having to deal with all the different kinds of, or forms of unfreedom in the world, whatever historical moment we're talking about. Yeah.
We got 10 minutes left. You want to talk about God?
Oh, sure. Sounds good. Sounds good.
So I'm here, brown Muslim. Yes. You're here, black Christian.
Yes.
What do you make of this growing popularity of white atheists, Bill Maher, Sam Harris, Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens when he was alive, supposedly progressive, but really kind of declaring this rule that part of being progressive means not critiquing institutionalized religion, because we should.
Sure, absolutely.
But dismissing it outright and, mocking it, essentially. And of course, now the popular thing in that movement is, sure, we criticize all religions equally, but we have this unhealthy obsession with Islam. And really, under the guise of something progressive, just regurgitating all the same reactionary, racist kind of stuff that you would see on any Fox News broadcast.
No, that's very real, though, brother, and that's wonderfully put, though. But I do believe that, in these catastrophic times, so many of the responses are responses of deep desperation. People are grabbing for straws, and in some sense, is true for all of us, because we're really headed off a cliff as a species and as a planet. And so I spent a lot of time with Brother Bill Maher. I love him very deeply. He's a tremendous comic talent. He's wrong about a lot of things. But he's right about a lot of things, too. But, I mean, he's just so obsessed with the barbarities and atrocities of institutional religion. And as we know, he's absolutely right about that. That religions have a long history of being accommodated to most vicious forms of domination and oppression up until this very moment. There's no doubt about that. And you don't have to be some kind of naive proponent of the European Enlightenment to accept that. You know, Diderot and the others had moral compassion. Charles Darwin's moral compassion as a abolitionist in the struggle in the anti-slavery movement that was tied in some ways to his formulations of the common origins of all human beings, no matter what color, laying bare the truths based on the evidence available to him. So that on the one hand you say, well, in a world that is so thoroughly commodified, more and more criminalized, the possibilities for change and transformation seeming more and more held at arm's length, you see. What do? Well, you're looking for some kind of authority. And usually they're looking for the authority of science. Well, science, of course, is producing unbelievable quasi-memories in the form of technology. I mean, most of us have cell phones, and I'm not sure we understand exactly how they work, but they do. Technology has had tremendous breakthroughs, but human beings are still human beings. Same old creatures, fearful, insecure, knowing their bodies will be extinguished very soon, number of decades and what have you, you see, having to locate themselves in some historical flow connected to the past. And so you get persons who, people like the Dawkins and others, who oftentimes reacting, almost knee-jerk reactions against certain stereotypes of religion. Looking for authority, science, and also, how would you put it, part of so much of academic life, which is an intellectual arrogance founded on existential insecurity. You know what I mean? So it's just, you'd say to a Dawkins and so forth, let's just be funky though, brother. Let's be real. Get off your arrogance horse and so forth, and tell me who you really love. Well, I think love itself might be an outdated part of evolutionary. No. Do you love your mama? Yes, you do. I do too. Do you love? I see. What is the nature of that emotional attachment? It's not just a matter of fleeting connection, is it? You're willing to live and die for your grandmother, right? Yes. Okay, then. Now we're keeping it real. You see, we don't have the abstract academic discussion that puts us in the form of being spectators. You are now a participant in the flow of time and space, with all the things that go with it. You see, the risks, the insecurities, the fears. What are you really scared of? Let's be honest about it. All of us have various fears. Thomas Hobbes, disorder. James Joyce, betrayal. All human beings have our own unique and distinctive stories, that we have our own fears and insecurities and so forth. You see, let's just be candid about it. You see. That's why, the blues men and the jazz women are, for me, much more important than the academic models. Because with them, they'll tell you what they're fearful of up front. It may not make a lot of sense to you. They're not trying to convince you. They're trying to be honest. They're trying to lay their souls on the table. You either accept it or not. They say, I'm going to offer you my great big heart and soul. Here it is. What you think? Don't like it? That's cool. That's fine. I am who I am. I'm a mama's child and daddy's kid. You are too. But maybe we can overlap and find our commonality And I think that the kind of atheisms that are at running afoot right now have to be examined in that context. I like all forms of atheism that are critical of varieties of idolatry. You see, because for example, to be a prophetic Muslim means that the conception of Allah among right-wing, reactionary, crypto-fascist Muslims is an idol. Well, the atheist simply agrees with you on that and says, that's right, because every prophetic religious person is an atheist vis-a-vis the crypto-fascist versions of their own religion. I'll give you an example. I mean, if the Ku Klux Klan had the only conception of the Christian God, I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist, you see. If I'm a Jewish brother and sister, you see. If Netanyahu, right-wing Zionist brother, losing sight of the precious humanity of Palestinian brothers, if his conception of God was the only conception of God for Judaism, then prophetic Jews would have to be atheists. But to say, no, we have a different view of Yahweh. You got a different view of Allah. I got a different view of God vis-a-vis the Ku Klux Klan brothers. Well, the atheists just remind us that the critique of idolatry must be integral to anybody's conception of what it is to be human. They just believe that all the gods are idols. And I say, well, that's taking it a bit far, but I mean, I can understand, but that's taking it a bit far.
I don't mind their critiques of the crypto-fascism, but I just wish they had the same spotlight on their own history. So when Bill Maher says, you know, we're better because we built liberal democracy and we made it, like, did America fall out of the sky? Like, did you?
Absolutely.
Why don't you have even a 5th grade understanding of history?
And of course, what that reminds us is almost where we started, is that truth, capital T, is bigger than all of us. And you say, okay, Brother Maher, if you really want to tell the truth about the emergence of liberal democracy, you're going to have to tell some truths about dispossessed land, stolen land, rape of women and children and so forth. You're going to have to tell truth about enslavement. So you're going to tell truth about wage slavery. You're going to tell truth about patriarchal households and domestic violence and male egos, insecure, attacking at women because they don't want to attack the bosses, but they claim to be so courageous and so brave and so forth and so on. And that's where the artists come in again. Old Banjo Patterson, old Brother Lawson, Mary Gilmore, and some of these Australian brothers and sisters say, we got some stories about the formation of this white supremacist democracy called Australia. And those artists have something to say about that emergence, that waltzing Matilda. Oh, yeah, there's some serious things to Patterson. Now, how does that relate to the breakdancing Muslim? Fascinating connection.
I was forced to sing it in school. That's how
I love it, I love it.
There's a sign that says no time remaining with red lights on it, so
it's just...
that's it. But we have time for 5 or 6 questions. If people come up to the mic here, we'll take questions from the audience very quickly.
We can have as many questions as you like.
Just make sure they're questions.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true.
Thank you so much, Brother West. It's a privilege to have you here and to listen to what you have to say. I'm from Geelong, which is Wathaurong country. I pay my respects to those elders past and present. And I really want to ask or touch on questions about domestic violence. In Australia, 2 women a week die as a result of intimate partner violence.
Domestic violence.
It is the leading cause of death and disability for women of between the ages of 15 and 44. And when I read about the various anti-women laws and acts and what some people call the war on women in the US, I wonder if you might like to comment on those situations.
I'm sorry I couldn't hear every word, but it was what was the... It was about domestic violence.
Your thoughts on domestic violence and the war on women?
And the
war on women.
On the war on women, yes. Absolutely. And I think, again, the history is very important. I know the history in the United States is one in which nationalism so deeply rooted in white supremacy tend not just to go hand in hand with male supremacy, but you have notions of the frontier that give permission to moral regeneration through violence. And it's not just expansion of other people's land, but it's also domestic violence in the private sphere as well. And therefore, the dominant forms of nationalism, the land as motherland, to be protected by the male warriors, you see. And male power vis-a-vis women become inscribed, institutionalized, and even legalized. And so the question becomes, how do we keep in contact with the precious humanity of women who find themselves in these kinds of social experiments and have domestic violence rationalized or overlooked, hidden, and concealed? And the movements, and you have to have courageous persons in place willing to put the spotlight on the ugly realities to reshape public opinion. And to me, it's not just domestic violence, it's a form of terrorism. It's a form of terrorism and has to be understood as such. Does that begin to get at your question? Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dr. West. My question's about the relationship between the LGBT civil rights movement in the US and the race-based civil rights movement in the 60s. So a lot of people frame the LGBT rights movement now as sort of an extension or the scion of this 1960s race-based civil rights movement. And what's amazing is huge progress has been made in the US and here. Like, it seems like the zeitgeist is one of, acceptance of same-sex relationships and what have you, and amazing progress has been made. But the same progress hasn't been made, it seems, in terms of racial justice and the earlier civil rights movement. So I'm curious as to your view of how it is that, this zeitgeist is so positive, leaning towards justice in terms of LGBT issues, but not, it seems, towards racial issues in the US.
Yes, I appreciate the question. Brother, one is that the magnificent successes that my precious lesbian sisters and gay brothers and bisexuals and transgender peoples have experienced in the United States are worthy of celebration. But they're still within the liberal order. It's very much like the early movements of the civil rights movement. So within the liberal order, it's not a threat to the wealth equality, the corporate elites, the big banks, the big corporations, their connection with politicians, with the monies that flow. So it allows the neoliberal structures to remain in place as these now legally based rights are protected. And I do believe, I think that liberalism does play a very important role. We know historically liberalism has engaged in marvelous critiques of the monarchs and so forth. Now I know Australia is still a bit ambivalent about their relation to the monarch, but you still got your own liberal order. You don't really have a republic, but it's something in between. But it's still a force for good, because the rights must be protected, no doubt. But when then liberal sisters and gay brothers become part of movements where fundamental changes are called for, that's something very, very different. And because homophobia has been so thoroughly saturated and circulated and sedimented in cultures across the world, just the liberal victories justify breakdancing for a little while. But then once you get those rights, you say, no, we've got some gay brothers on Wall Street who are indifferent toward the poor. We got some lesbian sisters who are still racist. We got some bisexual folk who are still anti-gay Jewish in hatred, anti-Muslim in hatred, anti-Arab in hatred, don't want to come to terms with the more universal calls for freedom across the board. This is true for any movement, not just LGBT, but it's true for any black movement, women's movement, and so on. But I think the last 20, 30 years in the States, we've seen unbelievable changes, and it's been a very positive thing, but it's going to exhaust its possibilities and have to raise more fundamental questions. Then the challenge will be. Now, what's marvelous about the Black Lives Movement is it's primarily led not just by visionary, courageous black women, but black queer women. That's historically unprecedented in the history of the black freedom movement. We know Bayard Rustin was a gay brother that could not surface visibly in King's movement because of his gay identity. Same was true for James Baldwin, why both of them couldn't speak at the March on Washington. Baldwin partly because he was too militant, but also because of his gay orientation. And so that the idea of the black queer leadership playing a disproportionate and magnificent role, I think is a very positive thing. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks very much, Cornel West. It was a fabulous decolonisation moment here, and really good. I'm from the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation area. Redfern Tent Embassy is a big campaign that everyone should look out for. Check it out on Facebook, support it. But my question actually is, you gave a fantastic stinging critique of capitalism here tonight. And you also mentioned Venezuela's hip-hop, political hip-hop scene, and I'm wondering, I had the fortune to go to Bolivia and check out the indigenous-led democratic cultural revolution. And I think that Latin America is leading the anti-neoliberal movements. I wanted you to comment on what you thought about that, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, and also now we're seeing Greece, the working class of Greece really moving into action around supporting Syriza, the party that closed the refugee detention centres and is attempting to move outside the bounds of neoliberalism. We're seeing elections in Spain, maybe the left will win. Can you comment a little bit about this anti-capitalist movements that are taking power, the poor and the people are taking power in these countries?
Yeah, wonderful question. Wonderful question, definitely. And in a way, I just want to ditto your own eloquent formulation of it. You're absolutely right. Latin America has been ahead decades of many of those in the American empire, let's say. The critique of neoliberalism goes all the way back to the 70s and 80s. And as you begin to have political elites move into some of the higher positions in Venezuela and Bolivia and Brazil and so forth, you began to get certain kinds of social democratic programs that had impact on the poor. Of course, the fear is always the capture by international capital, even of those political elites, so that Zula and the others still ended up with too many neoliberal policies. We saw that with Nelson Mandela. You come in with strong revolutionary fervor, and then you end up with neoliberal policies because you're caught, and then you don't have politicians who have backbone and nerve. Right now, of course, South Africa is a mess because the ANC, which has such a great history, has become more and more just a neoliberal organization living on the memory of the great Tombos and Mandelas and Sister Susulu and so forth. And you're right about Spain, you're right about Greece. All of these are signs and sources of tremendous hope. Tremendous hope, and it's especially so for those of us in the United States, and my hunch also here in Australia, where it's difficult to have your progressive utopian energies enacted and embodied on the ground in institutional policies. It's a very, very important thing to keep in contact with those kinds of operations out there. And the landless peasant movement in Brazil against the progressive president, very important. The peasants in Mexico against the liberal politicians and so on. But I'm just with you 100%. There's little for me to add, given the richness of what you had to say.
Hello, Mr. West, and thank you for an incredibly enlightening evening. Before I ask my question, I just would also like to pay my respects to the rightful owners of the lands on which we're gathered here today. My question, I guess, is, as somebody, as a black African woman living in Australia who has only in very recent years of her life, of my life, begun to be able to describe the effects of institutionalized racism and how it's affected my life, my community's life, other communities of color and how they function. And that realization is often accompanied with a very, very strong and very fierce feeling of hatred. And I don't think I've ever seen somebody be able to speak and use terms that are often very linguistically violent, like white supremacy, and in the same sentence be able to talk about love and about, you know, all of those things. And I feel like in my mind, maybe until tonight, those things were polar opposites. And, well, in a way, I still think they do stand like that in my mind, but there was a shift. So my question is, what kind of advice or how did that happen for you, to be honest?
What was that last question?
How did it happen for you?
How did it happen to me? Oh. Well, one is that, of course, I mean, I come out of a family, my God, you know, Clifton, Irene West. If you had a chance to meet my parents, oh, Lord. If I could be just 1/3 of the person they were, I wouldn't have lived in vain. The same was true with my brother Cliff and Cynthia and Cheryl. I mentioned today, too, my son Clifton, that I'm a love child. You know, I've had so many love injections in me. It's so thick that it'd be hard for me to actually just opt for any kind of hatred of persons. I do hate injustice. I hate white supremacy. I don't have a hatred of white brothers and sisters. When they subscribe to white supremacy, I hate their cowardliness. I hate their conformism. But I know they can change, because I've seen folk change. Malcolm changed. People do change. Some don't change. Uh-oh. What we gonna do? Organize for self-defense. You're not gonna be allowing your hate to attack these precious Aboriginal children, Aboriginal men and women, black and brown children, black and brown men and women. I mean, part of the problem in the United States is that we actually do have a lot of black leaders who talk about a certain kind of love and empathy, but they love everybody but black people. Because that's a way of being successful. And they end up being well adjusted to injustice, you see. And that's something that must be radically called into question. But keep in mind, I mean, you know, there's no such thing as black music without the centrality of love. Without the centrality of love. You love Aretha, you're going to have to end up loving some white folk. Because she's a love warrior. You know what I mean? You love Marvin Gaye, you're going to end up loving everybody. That Negro is a love warrior. You know, now he may not have loved himself with the drugs and things, but he's a love warrior. Nina Simone, we go on and on and on. And that's my tradition. I go down with that, and the worm's gonna get me, at least get my body with love, the last word on my lips. But that's my tradition. I understand persons who may not come out of that tradition, may not have experienced certain kinds of love and therefore be unwilling to talk about it publicly. And for me, it's also a matter of what is required for a long distance runner. I can't conceive of going through life without a militant tenderness and a subversive sweetness and a radical gentleness. See, if justice is what love looks like in public, then tenderness is what love feels like in private. You know what I mean? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name's Pikiri Rusker. I'm a Gurrumpul and Yagara woman. My question relates to, I guess I work in an Aboriginal organisation that was set up by a huge significant movement of Aboriginal people to push for Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs. but it's yet so reactionary. And so I'm working within this system that ain't working for Aboriginal people. So we go and set up Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance to work external to those systems. And we're taking to the streets because we're not content with what's going on, with the injustices that continue to occur for Aboriginal people. Uncle Gary Foley, it's what he's been doing his whole life, and many of our grandparents and elders have been doing. What do we need to be doing differently to create real change for Aboriginal people in this country? How do we kill white supremacy?
That's a tough one. I don't really have an answer to that question. I don't understand Australian society that well. The histories that I've read, provided some insights. I used to spend a little time with a brother named Manning Clark. When he'd come to New York, he wrote some fascinating epical histories. I don't know how much of it was true, but it was fascinating. But it gave me some sense of what the formation of Australian identity was all about. And I could see, just how deep the white supremacy cut. But I look at it in this way, that on the one hand, there does have to be some coalescing with larger numbers of courageous vanilla Australians who are on fire for justice, which embraces and even gives centrality to Aboriginal plight and predicament. It's not the only plight and predicament. It's got to be tied to domestic violence in both contexts. It has to be applied to workers' people, workers' movements. It has to be applied to gays and lesbians. But there has to be some coalescing. On the other hand, and this is what I think James Baldwin's point was, that Australia has got to come to terms with its history because chickens come home to roost. You reap what you sow. Sooner or later, truth crushed to earth will rise again. The suffering that you have denied will come back, just like the return of the repressed. And when it does come back, you know what they're going to do? They're going to run to Gary Foley and the others. Oh, we really got a problem now. Oh, my God, we got a deep crisis. It is now across the board. And what you've been talking about all these years was feeling as if you were on the margin. We need your voice now than anything else. Brother Foley and others just sit back and say, you don't say. You don't say. Really? Really? You thought somehow you could muddle through and push the truth to the side and conceal the suffering to the side? Sooner or later, you got to come to terms. Just like in our own individual lives. You try to just muddle through, live on the surface, be superficial, and sooner or later, bam! The return of the memory of the catastrophe and the effects and consequences hit you. And the memory says, I'm coming. The history says, I'm coming. You will not be free until you deal with me. That's the history. So, but now you hope it doesn't reach that point, because at that point it can also go just completely fascist. That's the other possibility. That's our possibility in the United States. See, I live in a country where America needs a revolution, but at the moment it's only capable of a counter-revolution. Because every person like me, you got at least 45 white supremacist militia folk. That's a problem. You know what I mean? For every progressive, you got at least 21 white supremacist crypto fascists. What you gonna do in that country? Oh, you better be improvisational. But you also got to tell the truth. That's not an answer to your question, but it's a formulation that would lead toward a possible answer given what unfolds. But I just don't know enough about Australia to be able to speak directly to what you're talking about. Thank you so much, and I salute the work you do.
Thank you so much, Brother West. Just in the spirit of speaking the truth, I think I do have some slight disagreements.
Sure.
Just in regards to I'll make 2 points and then one very quick question. One, I think, the participation and leadership of gay and women in the civil rights movement and so forth is not unprecedented. Like in terms of vis-a-vis Black Lives Movement, you think about like people like Barrett Rustin, who was a black gay communist, was a mentor and comrade of Martin Luther King, right? But he's written out of history. You have think about our black brothers and sisters, the Queens, who are in Stonewall. They're the ones who led the LGBTI movement.
Absolutely.
And so forth.
But let me just ask this, brother, before you get to your second question, and we'll see whether we agree. Would you agree that with the black queer leadership in the age of Ferguson, in which the queer identity is public, in which it is unapologetic, and in which it is central? See, Barrett Rustin could not have an outright public identity that was gay with Martin and Fannie Lou and the others. That was the distinction I was making. It's not that there have not been courageous gay brothers and lesbian sisters, and Audre Lorde, we can go on in terms of the great history, but in terms of being public identity in major positions of leadership. That's the point. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, no. We on the same page. We're on the same page. But no, you got another question.
So, and then the final one, which relates to, because Aamer said that, which again I have disagreement. Aamer said that, in the polls and the opinion polls around Australia, around refugees, it's been unchanging. There's still the 70-80% who, hardcore support, locking up and torturing refugees in Australia. And I think there was a shift. We did go from Howard's, we all, could decide who and when in the 2000s, to Rudd winning an election saying we will get rotating protection visas, we will get children out of detention. The campaign that we did and fight and win, that we were part of, did actually shift the public opinion. The problem is it got shifted back again. And it got shifted back largely because the Labour Party, decided racism is a vote winner when it's not. But finally, the question is still, okay, even if that was true, you still have 20 or 30% of the population says this is horrible, this is disgusting what you do to our, brothers and sisters who come across the seas. Yeah. Well, the problem is they're not here. That's still 20, 30% of 20 million people. That's 5 million, my math is terrible. 7 million people in Australia who are against what the government does. The problem is, how do we mobilize that 7 million people to actually come out on the streets? And that's my question. How do we cut across that line saying, that's cut across the fear of job insecurity and, xenophobia and people are going to, whatever it is that the government wants to whip up, and say, how do we mobilize those people to actually come out and act? Turn that passive sentiment into reality.
No, I hear you. No, I think that's true.
How to mobilize the full 25% that are sympathetic.
When I was in Chicago, Zaytoon and I, we met a brother named Jared, who was part of the loving the asylum seekers and the refugees, and it's actually rooted in the church. Because if you had religious activists of courage and conscience who could somehow mobilize the church resources and then connect it to mosque, temple, synagogue, then you had your secular activists all coming together to try to reshape public consciousness. You simply have to have strong voices that have moral authority and say that it is a crime against humanity to have precious children who are detained. It's a crime against humanity to have folk dangling in stateless conditions when they can be incorporated within your own social experiment. And just be very strong about that. It may sound as if it's outlandish at the moment. In the same way women voting in the 19th century was outlandish. And thank God New Zealand and Australia beat most modern industrial societies at having women vote. What sounds outlandish has to be talked about honestly, with integrity, and you begin to mobilize more and more people to do what? To make sure that our precious brothers and sisters who are under detention, our asylum seekers, our refugees are treated with decency and dignity.
Thank you very much. As an Anglo-Australian who hungers for justice in our white supremacist society, and as a feminist who hungers for justice in our patriarchy, I want to ask your advice as an educator. How do white people who are working within the university system nurture our brown students in what is essentially an abusive, racist institution that if all people of all genders are going to contribute to a more just society, then education and tertiary education, I believe, is incredibly important as being part of that system. But it is a brutalising, abusive system. How do those of us who have brown students support them through this system without also being part of the brutalisation?
That was a wonderful question. Wonderful question. I think that's very important. I think it's impossible for people of color to be able to matriculate within white supremacist power structures without having a slice of courageous, vanilla elites who care, nurture, stand beside. I wouldn't be sitting here if it were not for John Rawls, Richard Rorty, Sheldon Wolin, Hilary Putnam, Stanley Cavell, Robert Nozick. I can go right down the road. Those are Harvard and Princeton professors, right? Now, I, of course, disagree with with some of what they had to say. I learned a whole lot from them. But as human beings, they were part of that caring, nurturing process. All of us are in need of care and nurture of some sort, no matter what color we are. And they're already nurturing your number of white students too. But to be able to reach out in that way, in a non-paternalistic way, we're not talking about somehow looking at them as children or looking at black people or Aboriginal people as people who need to be uplifted. No, this is not missionary work. This is human relations that are mutual and reciprocal, but still student vis-a-vis professor. And that's a very important role that you play. Crucial role that you play. And I know Brother Trail could testify to it himself in terms of the magnificent caring and nurturing he received at the University of Melbourne. Is that right, though, brother? We had the brother fly up the other month to my office from Australia. We talked about dissertation for hours. And you can see that wonderful kind of caring and nurturing that is so very important for all students. And it's crucial that that be in place for students of color. I salute what you're doing. And we know, the night side of institutions of higher learning, they've been commodified and corporatized and bureaucratized and marketized in ways that are just sad. But I mean, that's part of the world in which we live. But it doesn't mean that Socratic energy is completely suffocated. And it doesn't mean that the kind of nurturing that you're talking about should not and does not take place across racial and gender and sexual orientational lines.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brother West, what a privilege it is to be here tonight. Thank you very much. I'm fortunate enough to be from the same town as Brother Trail Dowie. Wow. I pay my respects to the Gunditj Mara brothers and sisters, past, present and future. Yeah. My question for you and for me and for everybody here is, what is it about creativity and expression that we can do as individuals to help rid us of this pain, this white supremacy as a white brothers and sisters? What can we all do through expression and creativity to help with this change?
Yeah, no, beautiful question though. Definitely. I think part of it is that in a market-driven culture, we tend to put a premium on being smart and just being rich. And I say, let the phones be smart. We've got to be wise. We've got to be compassionate. What allows us to get outside of our own skin is empathy, imagination. So you can be highly creative and still lack empathy. You see, just like there's been a lot of smart Nazis. There's been a lot of smart male supremacists, smart white supremacists, smart homophobes. What happened? They still too locked into their narrowness. There's been a lot of smart, narrow nationalists who believe that somehow only people within their own nation have value. I mean, we just had President Obama apologize for U.S. drones dropping bombs on an American and an Italian. Almost tears are flowing. Well, wait a minute, brother. You'd already killed 231 children in Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Libya. When are you going to apologize for them? You didn't kill 2,000 innocent folk in those countries. When are you going to apologize for them? No, Brother West. Our Americans are special people, and Italians are special. When it comes to these other folk, we don't have to apologize at all. In fact, we're going to lie about it and say we're not killing anybody until it's shown that we are. You say, oh, wait a minute. It's not just a matter of the smartness and creativity. We need creativity. I'm not defending stupidity now. I don't want anybody. We need smartness, intelligence, wisdom, but we also want courage to be empathetic. You see, that's what Shelley had in mind when he talked about poets. He wasn't talking about just versifiers. All human beings who have the imagination and empathy and courage to conceive of an alternative world different than the present. Those poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Become a poet in terms of an artist of your life. And whatever town you're from, you have the creativity and the empathy to get outside of your skin as far as possible. Again, we're all cracked vessels now. So there's only so much that we can do, you know. Some of us are not going to be Martin Luther King Jr., no matter how hard we try. It's just we got some psychic constraints. Given the early formation, you know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. It's like you're going to blow your horn all you want. You're not going to be Coltrane for the most part. That's all right. Blow it anyway. Because in the end, you see, I come from a people, our anthem, a blues people, is lift every voice. It doesn't say lift every echo. So you don't want to be a copy. You want to be an original. Just like your fingerprint. Your voice is only yours. I'm not just talking about your vocalization. I'm talking about what's inside of you and how you can touch others, whatever your gifts are, relative to your context and relative to the choices that you make. And so I salute you, though, brother. And I salute each and every one of you all. Thank you so very much for coming out.
Ladies and
Thank
gentlemen,
you so
Cornel
very
West.
much for coming out. Definitely. Absolutely. God bless y'all. God bless you. God bless you. Stay strong. God bless you. God bless you. Stay strong, Melbourne.